Welcome back to Decoding Causality, Season 1. We're still working our way through the Book of Why by Judia Pearl and Dana McKenzie, and today we'll be tackling Chapter 7, Beyond Adjustment, the Conquest of Mount Intervention. This episode and summary were prepared by Amir Rafai.
Moving beyond just observing correlations, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
It's exciting stuff, really. We're transitioning from just kind of mapping the terrain to actually, climbing that mountain of causation, really understanding what happens when we take action.
We've spent the last few chapters wrestling with those tricky confounders, teasing out real causal relationships from those sometimes misleading correlations. So Chapter 7, how does this chapter help us understand what happens when we intervene? Like implement a new policy or try a different medical treatment?
Well, it starts with a backdoor adjustment, a method you might have seen used with linear regression, where we control for confounders to try and isolate those causal effects.
So like if we're studying, let's say, a new drug's effect on heart attacks, and gender is a confounder, we'd need to estimate the drug's effects separately for males and females, and then calculate a weighted average based on the gender distribution in the whole population.
Precisely. But Chapter 7, it urges us to be cautious about leaning too heavily on regression coefficients, even when they've been adjusted. They represent statistical trends, not necessarily causal effects, and that's where causal diagrams come in. They're crucial for making sure that an adjusted variable really blocks all backdoor paths between that intervention and the outcome.
So backdoor adjustment, it's useful, but it really needs data on all the confounders. What about those situations where we can't actually measure a confounder?
That's where the front door adjustment comes in. This method is pretty clever, actually. It allows us to estimate causal effects even when we're missing data on the confounder.
How is that even possible? If we don't have the data, how can we control for it?
Yeah, imagine you're studying the effects of exposure to a specific chemical, right? And how it affects a specific disease. Now, let's say there's some unknown genetic predisposition that's confounding the relationship. We can't measure this gene, but we know the chemical causes a measurable change in blood marker levels.
Got it.
And we also know that that change in blood markers, that contributes to the disease.
Okay, so instead of directly linking the chemical exposure to the disease, we break it down, right?
Right.
Chemical to blood marker and blood marker to disease.
Yes. We estimate the effect of the chemical on the blood markers, no backdoor path to block there.
Right.
And then the effect of those blood markers on the disease. Now there, we block the backdoor path by adjusting for the chemical. Combining these two estimations, well, that gives us the effect of the chemical on the disease.
That's a really ingenious way to bypass the missing data problem. Is this just a theoretical idea, or has it been applied in any real-world studies?
Oh, there's a great example from the book. Political scientists Glynn and Kashin, they used front door adjustment on data from the JTPA job training program. They actually found that those front door estimates, even with potential bias, were more accurate than the traditional backdoor adjustments. It's a powerful technique.
The chapter also introduces something called due calculus. Is this a way to strengthen the conclusions that we can draw from observational data?
Think of due calculus as a set of rules for manipulating causal expressions, like mathematical equations almost. It provides us with a systematic way to figure out whether a causal effect can even be estimated from the data we have.
So instead of relying on intuition, we have these concrete rules to determine if calculating a causal effect is even possible. Can you give us an example of how these rules actually work in practice?
Well, remember that front door formula we discussed?
Yes.
That can actually be derived step by step using the 3 rules of due calculus. Adding or deleting irrelevant observations, replacing interventions with observations, or vice versa under specific conditions, and then deleting or adding interventions that have no effect on the outcome. It's a beautiful demonstration of how some pretty simple rules can unlock some really complex causal relationships.
It sounds like having a set of tools to construct a proof for any causal effect that can be estimated from the data. Does this have applications beyond just those observational studies?
Oh, absolutely. Due calculus can help us figure out whether randomizing a different, more accessible variable can still help us estimate the causal effect of the original variable. For example, if directly changing people's diets is difficult, maybe randomizing access to nutritional counseling can provide valuable insights.
So it's about finding these creative ways to approach the problem. Can due calculus also help with the challenge of knowing whether the findings from one study can be applied to other populations or settings?
Yes. Due calculus can help us assess the transportability of experimental results to different environments, addresses that challenge of external validity. It gives us this framework to analyze the conditions under which a causal effect should remain stable across different contexts.
So far, we've talked about blocking backdoor paths or finding those clever front doors. But what if those aren't options? Like when you're dealing with unobservable confounders.
That's where instrumental variables come in. They act like a randomized intervention within an observational study.
Can you give us an example of how they work?
Imagine you're trying to figure out the effectiveness of a new educational program.
Okay.
There are a lot of potential confounders there, like parental involvement, that are tough to measure. But if we can find something that strongly predicts participation in the program, but isn't directly related to the outcome, maybe a random assignment to a school that offers the program, we might be able to use that as an instrumental variable.
So we could compare the outcomes of students who are randomly assigned to schools with and without the program.
Right.
And that would give us a better sense of the program's true effectiveness.
Exactly. That random assignment, it's like a natural experiment. It helps us isolate the impact of the program. This echoes the classic example of Dr. John Snow's investigation of the cholera epidemic. He used the water company serving a household as an instrumental variable to show that it was contaminated water, not miasma, that caused cholera.
Are there other examples where something like the water company serves as a natural randomizer?
Absolutely. One example is studying the effects of statins on cholesterol reduction when you have patients who don't always take their medication as prescribed.
Okay, yeah.
Some people assigned to take statins might not adhere to the treatment, which creates a confounding factor. However, random assignment to statins can actually be used as an instrumental variable
I see.
because it influences statin use, but is independent of other factors affecting cholesterol.
It's fascinating how we can leverage these seemingly random occurrences to uncover causal relationships.
It's like nature's giving us clues and we just need to learn how to read them.
We've been talking about situations where a naturally occurring event acts like an instrumental variable. Are there other ways to find or create these instrumental variables?
Well, there's a powerful technique called Mendelian randomization that uses genes as instrumental variables. Since genes are essentially randomized at conception, they can help us study the causal effect of a trait on an outcome.
Genes as instruments. Can you explain how that works?
Okay, let's say we're studying the effect of HDL cholesterol on heart attack risk.
Right.
But lifestyle choices are confounding the relationship.
Right.
If we can find a gene that specifically increases HDL levels without directly impacting lifestyle or LDL cholesterol, we can use that gene as an instrument.
So we're looking for a gene that acts like a random assignment to different levels of HDL cholesterol.
Precisely. In 2012, a large study used a gene known to influence HDL levels as an instrument. They found that, contrary to what previous observational studies had suggested, there wasn't a clear benefit from higher HDL levels in terms of heart attack risk.
That's amazing how we can use genetic information to unravel these complex causal relationships.
Mendelian randomization, it's a powerful tool, especially when traditional methods aren't enough.
This chapter is packed with techniques for understanding cause and effect. Backdoor adjustment, front door adjustment, due calculus, instrumental variables, Mendelian randomization. It feels like a whole new way of approaching research questions.
We're moving beyond just observing patterns. We're moving towards truly understanding the underlying causal forces that shape our world. It's a true conquest of malintervention.
Before we wrap up this part of our discussion, what's the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the key message is that we're not passive observers. We have the tools to actually interrogate nature, to ask what if, and to go beyond just correlations to uncover true causal mechanisms. And these tools, they're not just for scientists. They're relevant to anyone who's trying to understand the complexities of cause and effect in their own lives.
We'll be back after a short break to continue our exploration of this fascinating chapter. Stay tuned. We've been talking about the power of these instrumental variables, especially when we're faced with those unobservable confounders. But it seems like we need to be extra careful about the assumptions we're making when we use them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Instrumental variables, they rely on some pretty specific causal assumptions. Independence from those confounders, no direct path to the outcome, a strong association with the treatment variable. And that's where those causal diagrams become really, really valuable.
We talked about those three key properties, but how do the diagrams help us make sure those assumptions actually hold up?
Well, they allow us to visualize the relationships between the variables. We can actually see, like on paper, if those three properties are met, and if there are any potential violations that might skew our results.
So it's like a blueprint. It helps us avoid making those faulty inferences. Could we say that Dr. Snow, even without having the formal tools of causal diagrams, was kind of thinking this way when he investigated the cholera outbreak?
Oh, absolutely. His meticulous observations and reasoning, it essentially allowed him to create a mental model of those causal relationships, similar to what we can now represent with a causal diagram. He saw that the water company was independent of confounders, like miasma, didn't directly cause cholera, but was strongly linked to water purity. That mental model, which we can now represent visually, was the basis for his conclusion about contaminated water and cholera.
These causal diagrams, they help make our assumptions transparent and testable. Is this a relatively recent development?
Well, instrumental variables were known before the causal revolution, as it's called. Causal diagrams have really clarified how they work, made them more accessible to researchers, I'd say.
So they've helped demystify a technique that was once pretty complex and difficult to grasp. Are there other benefits to using these causal diagrams when you're working with instrumental variables?
For sure. They let us explore much more complex scenarios than just those simple 4-variable models. We can look at cases with, multiple instruments, imperfect instruments, or even situations where we need to adjust for additional variables to create a valid instrumental variable. Causal diagrams, they really open up the possibilities.
It's like having a stronger lens, one that allows us to make more nuanced causal inferences.
Yeah.
Could you maybe give us an example of how a more complex situation might benefit from using both causal diagrams and instrumental variables?
Okay, imagine you're researching the impact of early childhood education and you want to see how it affects future earnings.
Okay.
A simple analysis might just compare the earnings of folks who went to preschool with those who didn't. But you've got so many other factors like parental socioeconomic status that could be confounding that relationship.
So just seeing a difference in earnings might not actually reflect the true causal effect of that early childhood education.
Exactly. Now, let's say there's a policy initiative that randomly offers free preschool to families in certain neighborhoods. That random assignment, that could act as an instrumental variable.
It creates a natural experiment where some kids have access to free preschool simply because of chance and others don't.
Precisely. And by using causal diagrams, we can map out all the potential relationships between the variables: socioeconomic status, preschool attendance, other interventions, and those future earnings. This helps us figure out if that random assignment truly satisfies the conditions for a valid instrumental variable, and if we need to make any additional adjustments for a really solid analysis.
Like we're making a roadmap to guide our analysis and make sure our conclusions are actually sound. But even with these powerful tools, we can't forget the human element in all of this. The Book of Why emphasizes the importance of human judgment and what it calls shoe leather research.
Couldn't agree more. Even with all these fancy techniques, causal inference isn't just mechanical, Human judgment is crucial in formulating those causal questions and making sure that the assumptions we're basing our analysis on are actually valid.
It seems like human intuition and experience are really important when creating those causal diagrams in the first place.
Exactly. They represent our beliefs about how the world works based on our understanding of the subject, previous research, and those careful observations. Shoe leather research, it's about going beyond the data, talking to experts, getting into the nitty-gritty details, and making sure that our causal assumptions are really plausible.
It's like a detective, right? Doing field work, gathering clues, talking to witnesses, and putting together a story that makes sense.
I love that analogy. Sometimes that field work might involve challenging those assumptions, revising our models, and even questioning what we thought we knew for sure. It's a back and forth between theory and evidence.
Can you give us an example of how that shoe leather research might lead us to revise those assumptions?
Let's say we're studying how effective a new medication is for treating depression.
Okay.
And we find a study that uses a specific gene as an instrumental variable, arguing that it influences whether patients stick to their medication.
So by looking at the relationship between the gene, medication adherence, and those depression symptoms, the researchers are trying to figure out the medication's true effectiveness.
Yeah, exactly. But then through shoe leather research, like interviewing patients and clinicians, we discover that this gene, it not only influences medication adherence, but also affects patients' willingness to seek therapy.
So the assumption that the gene only affects the outcome, those depression symptoms, through the treatment, that medication adherence is actually wrong.
Exactly. That new information, which we got through those firsthand insights, it reveals a problem with our instrumental variable assumptions. So we need to go back, revise our causal model, and maybe find a different instrumental variable or adjust our analysis accordingly.
It's a good reminder to stay humble, stay skeptical, and really dig deep to make sure our conclusions are solid. We're like those detectives of causality, right?
Precisely. It's a partnership between that human judgment and that rigorous analysis.
We've talked a lot about how important those causal diagrams are for ensuring our assumptions are actually solid. But how do we know if those causal relationships that we've mapped out, how do we know if they apply to other populations or settings? The issue of transportability, that seems especially tricky.
Transportability, it's often overlooked, yeah. We might find a really strong causal effect in one study, but does it hold true in different contexts, right? Do calculus, that can actually help us think about transportability in a more systematic way.
So it gives us a framework for analyzing when a causal effect might stay consistent across different situations.
Ah.
That seems incredibly useful, especially when you're trying to take research findings and apply them to real-world policy decisions.
Oh, absolutely. We can actually use do calculus to pinpoint those factors that might modify a causal effect. See how sensitive our findings are to those factors, and then make better decisions about whether we can apply those results to new populations or environments.
Can you give us an example of how do calculus helps us tackle this transportability issue?
Okay, imagine a study in, let's say, Canada that shows a government program was really successful in increasing vaccination rates.
Okay.
Can we just assume that that same program will have the same effect in, say, South Africa?
Right.
You know, a country with very different healthcare systems, different cultural norms, and even different levels of trust in the government. Do calculus helps us analyze those potential differences.
So instead of just blindly implementing the program in that new context, we use do calculus to understand which parts of the program might need to be adjusted.
Exactly. We might find that the program's success was really dependent on strong community engagement or partnerships with local healthcare providers. Do calculus helps us identify these crucial factors and see if they even exist in that new environment. If they don't, well, then we can try to proactively address those potential challenges.
This seems really important for interventions that are aimed at changing behavior, where those cultural and social contexts play a huge role.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Do calculus, it gives us a framework for asking the right questions and avoiding those costly mistakes by assuming that what works in one place will automatically work in another.
This chapter, it really highlights that causal inference isn't just about finding those answers, it's about understanding when those answers are actually valid and being careful not to overstep what our evidence tells us. Can you give us an example of how this cautious approach might work in a real-world situation?
Sure. Let's say there's a study that finds a correlation between playing video games and aggressive behavior in teenagers.
Okay.
This might lead some people to jump to the conclusion that video games are causing the aggression and maybe even advocate for limiting access to them.
But without really understanding the causal relationships involved, we could be making a big mistake.
Exactly. A more cautious approach would be to explore those potential confounders. Do teenagers who are already prone to aggression tend to gravitate towards those violent video games? Are there other underlying factors like family dynamics or peer pressure that are contributing to both those video game preferences and the aggressive behavior?
It sounds like we need to use tools like those causal diagrams and consider those different causal pathways before we start making policy recommendations based just on a simple correlation.
Absolutely. A nuanced understanding of causality would involve carefully designed studies, maybe using those instrumental variables or natural experiments to really isolate the specific effect of video games on aggression and disentangle it from all those other contributing factors.
It's a reminder to be critical of research and avoid oversimplifying these complex issues. But this nuanced approach, it seems crucial for individual decision-making too, right?
It is. Imagine someone reading a headline that screams, "Drinking coffee linked to a longer lifespan."
Okay.
They might decide, all right, I'm going to start chugging coffee every day, thinking it'll magically make them live longer.
But without understanding the context, the methodology, and the limitations of that study, that decision might be totally off base.
Precisely. A critical thinker would stop and ask, hold on, what kind of study was this? Were there other factors like lifestyle choices or genetic predispositions that might explain that link? Has this study been replicated in other populations?
So using the principles of causal inference can actually help us avoid being swayed by those flashy headlines and make more informed choices about our health, our finances, even our everyday lives.
You got it. The tools and techniques we've been discussing, they're not just for scientists in their ivory towers. They're for anyone who wants to think more clearly, make better decisions in a world that's full of these complex causal relationships.
This has been a really insightful look at the conquest of Mount Intervention. We've covered so much, from backdoor and front door adjustments to do calculus, instrumental variables, and the importance of that human judgment and transportability. I feel like our listeners are now equipped to go out and tackle their own causal puzzles.
I hope so. Remember, the journey up Mount Intervention, it's ongoing. There's always more to learn, more to explore, and more to discover as we keep refining our understanding of cause and effect.
It's really remarkable how those causal diagrams can help us assess whether findings from one study can be applied to other populations or settings. But something you said earlier made me think. These tools and techniques, they're not just for researchers who are trying to understand complex studies, are they?
Nope, not at all.
We use causal reasoning all the time in our everyday lives.
Right.
From simple stuff like choosing what to eat for dinner to big decisions like picking a career path.
Yeah.
We're constantly trying to figure out, okay, what's going to happen if I do this?
Absolutely.
It almost feels like our brains are wired for this kind of causal thinking. We can't help but ask why and what if.
We're naturally curious, right?
Yep.
And here's the thing. As we've seen in this chapter, our intuitions about cause and effect can sometimes be a little off.
Right.
We might mix up correlation with causation, overlook those confounders, or even draw conclusions that the evidence just doesn't support.
And that's where these tools we've been discussing become so valuable.
Exactly.
Causal diagrams, do calculus, even that concept of instrumental variables. They can really help us sharpen our causal reasoning skills.
They give us that framework for testing assumptions, identifying those sneaky biases, and ultimately making better, more informed decisions, not just in research, but in all parts of our lives.
It's empowering to think we can use these tools to become better critical thinkers,
Yeah,
not just in our work, but in our personal lives too.
definitely.
Let's take health decisions, for example. You're evaluating a new diet or a new exercise plan.
Right.
Understanding these principles of causality can help you really understand the evidence, make choices that truly benefit your well-being.
It's like getting a new lens, a clearer way of seeing the world and how it all connects.
Yeah.
These tools help us untangle that complex web of cause and effect that's all around us.
It's about getting to that why behind the what, right?
Exactly.
And that understanding, it empowers us to make choices that are actually aligned with our goals and values.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been such an insightful conversation, really. We've explored so much in our deep dive into Chapter 7. As we wrap up this episode, is there one key takeaway you'd want our listeners to remember above all else?
Yeah, I'd say remember this. Those tools and techniques we've explored, they're powerful, but they're not magic. Causal inference is a process. It takes careful thought, rigorous analysis, and a good dose of healthy skepticism. Embrace that mindset of a detective of causality. Always be questioning those assumptions, looking for new evidence, and refining your understanding of how things work. By doing that, you'll be better equipped to navigate that tricky world of cause and effect and make more informed decisions in every aspect of your life.
That's a fantastic way to put it. It reminds us that this journey of understanding cause and effect, it's ongoing. Thank you so much for guiding us through this exploration of Mount Intervention. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine.
To our listeners, keep those why questions coming. Keep exploring those causal connections and keep climbing that mountain of knowledge. The view from the top is well worth the effort.
It always is.
And that's a perfect note to end on. We'll be back next time with another chapter from the Book of Why. Until then, keep those causal gears turning.